The sun was just beginning to rise over the busy Van Nuys Airport in California, casting long, warm shadows across the tarmac. It was the kind of morning that felt fresh and full of possibility, but for one man standing near the private terminal, it was just another Tuesday. He was tall and slim, dressed in clothes that looked like they had seen better days. He wore a simple, faded black t-shirt, an oversized green windbreaker that hung loosely on his shoulders, and a pair of well-worn boots. To finish the look, he pulled the brim of a worn baseball cap low over his eyes. If you walked past him, you probably wouldn't look twice. You might think he was a tired mechanic finishing a night shift or maybe a backpacker trying to catch a ride on a budget. But the truth was very different. Underneath that cap was one of the most famous faces in the world. It was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't filming a movie today, and he wasn't walking a red carpet. He was just a regular guy who wanted to get from Los Angeles to New York without the chaos of screaming fans and flashing cameras. Keanu let out a quiet breath. He loved his fans, truly, but sometimes a person just needs a moment of peace. He had a small backpack slung over one shoulder. It wasn't full of designer luggage or expensive gifts, it just had a few books, some water, and a change of clothes. He looked around the private terminal, watching the ground crew fueling the jets. It was a busy world of wealth and power, but Keanu felt strangely calm in his little disguise. He felt invisible, and right now, that was exactly what he wanted. He walked toward the plane he was scheduled to take. It was a beautiful Gulfstream GV, sleek and white, shining in the morning sun. Most people who fly on planes like this dress up in suits or expensive casual wear. They carry leather bags and talk loudly on their phones about business deals. Keanu did none of that. He walked with his head down, his hands in his pockets, moving with the quiet, easy grace that he was known for, but disguised under layers of ordinary fabric. As he stepped closer to the stairs leading up to the plane, a man in a crisp uniform stepped out to greet him. This was the lead flight attendant. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with perfectly gelled hair and a uniform that was pressed so sharply it looked like it could cut paper. He was used to serving billionaires, tech moguls, and movie stars. He had a certain way of looking at people. If you looked rich, his smile was bright. If you didn't, his eyes would glaze over, and his polite tone would become cold and mechanical. The attendant looked down from the top of the stairs at the man approaching. He saw the shabby jacket. He saw the worn boots. He didn't see a movie star. He saw someone who didn't belong. "Excuse me, sir," the attendant said, his voice loud and carrying across the quiet tarmac. He didn't say it with a smile. He said it with a hand raised, like a traffic officer stopping a car. "This is a private charter. Boarding is for invited passengers only." Keanu stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up, his face half hidden by the shadow of his cap. "I know," he said softly. His voice was calm and raspy. "I'm on the list." The attendant let out a small, dismissive laugh. He looked at his clipboard, tapping his pen against it impatiently. "Right. Look, there's been a mix-up, maybe you're looking for the commercial terminal. It's that way." He pointed a finger vaguely in the distance, not even bothering to be helpful. Keanu didn't get angry. He didn't shout, "Do you know who I am?" That wasn't his style. He just stood there for a moment, feeling the awkwardness of the situation. He knew how the world worked. People judged books by their covers all the time. It was a lesson he had learned years ago, and it was happening to him right now, on a Tuesday morning in Los Angeles. "I'm supposed to be on this flight," Keanu repeated, gently but firmly. "My name is Reeves." The attendant rolled his eyes, a tiny movement that showed just how annoyed he was. He scanned the list on his clipboard, not looking for the name, just performing a show of looking. "I don't see a Mr. Reeves for the main cabin seating." "Look, we have a strict policy about the caliber of passengers on this specific aircraft. The owner is very particular about the image of the flight." It was ironic. The words hung in the air. The attendant was talking about the image of the flight to the very person who had signed the check to buy the jet. But Keanu just nodded slowly. He realized that arguing would only make a scene, and a scene was the one thing he was trying to avoid. "Okay," Keanu said. He adjusted his backpack. "If I'm on the list, I'd like to board. If not, I can wait." The attendant sighed, a heavy, dramatic sound meant to show how put upon he was. "Fine. You can come up. But stay in the back, okay? Don't wander around. We have VIP guests joining us, and I don't want you bothering them. Just find a seat in the rear and keep your head down. The jump seat is probably where you'll be most comfortable if the main cabin is full." Keanu didn't argue. He didn't tell the attendant that the VIP guests the man was worried about were probably his own friends or colleagues. He just started up the stairs. As he walked past the attendant, he could smell the man's cologne, something expensive and strong. It was the smell of trying too hard. "Thanks," Keanu murmured as he passed. "Yeah, whatever. Just don't touch anything," the attendant muttered under his breath, turning his back to organize the silverware in the galley. Inside the plane, the air was cool and smelled of fresh leather and expensive champagne. It was beautiful. There were plush cream-colored seats, wooden tables, and soft lighting. Keanu walked past the main cabin area, which was spacious and luxurious. He continued all the way to the back, near the small galley and the crew seats. It was much quieter here. He sat down in a small seat by the window. It wasn't the plush captain's chair in the middle of the plane, but it was comfortable. He took off his backpack and set it between his feet. He looked out the small, round window at the runway. A fuel truck was driving by, and a mechanic was waving wands. From this angle, nobody could see his face. Just a guy in a green jacket watching the airport wake up. He thought about how strange life was. He could buy this plane 10 times over, yet here he was, being told to sit in the back and not touch anything. It was funny, in a sad kind of way. It showed how quickly people judged each other based on clothes and status. A few minutes later, the pilot came out of the cockpit. He was an older man with kind eyes and a mustache. He nodded at the attendant and then looked toward the back. He saw the familiar figure sitting in the corner. "Keanu," the pilot said, his face lighting up. "Good to see you, my friend. Ready to get out of here?" The attendant froze. He was holding a tray of crystal glasses. He spun around, his eyes wide. He looked at the pilot, then looked at the vagrant in the back seat. The man in the green jacket turned his head slightly and gave a small, shy wave. The disguise wasn't a trick to fool the pilot, it was just to fool the world. But in the small space of the airplane, the secret was out, at least for the pilot. "Ready as I'll be," Keanu said. The attendant didn't say a word. He quickly turned back to the galley, his face turning a shade of pale white. He busied himself with the glasses, clinking them together a little too loudly. He hadn't recognized the name Reeves on the list because he wasn't looking for a celebrity in a windbreaker. He was looking for a suit and tie. Now, he realized he had just told one of the kindest, most famous actors in the world to sit in the back and not touch anything. The plane began to taxi. The low rumble of the engines vibrated through the floor. Keanu leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. The adventure wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. He wondered what the flight would be like now that the attendant knew, or if the attendant would continue to be rude. Either way, Keanu was just going to enjoy the ride and the fact that, for a little while longer, he could still look out the window and just be a passenger in the sky. The plane lifted smoothly off the runway, climbing quickly into the bright blue sky above Los Angeles. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was quiet, but the air was thick with a strange kind of tension. The flight attendant, still trying to process what the pilot had said, moved stiffly around the galley. He kept stealing glances at the back of the plane, where the shabbily dressed man sat looking out the window. The attendant's mind was racing. He felt a hot knot of embarrassment forming in his stomach, mixed with a stubborn defensiveness. He didn't want to believe that the man in the worn-out windbreaker was actually the owner of the jet. It felt easier to believe that there was a mix-up or that the pilot was just being friendly to a random hitchhiker. As the plane reached its cruising altitude, the fasten seatbelt sign dinged off. The attendant took a deep breath, smoothed his uniform, and decided to act as if nothing had happened. His professional pride was on the line. If he admitted he was wrong now, he would look foolish. So, he chose to double down on his assumption. He grabbed a menu printed on thick, heavy cardstock and walked toward the main cabin area where the other passengers were sitting. There were only a few others on board, a businessman in a sharp suit and a couple dressed in expensive designer clothes. The attendant treated them with utmost care, smiling warmly and asking about their preferences. Then, he turned his attention to the back of the plane. He walked down the aisle, his shoes clicking softly on the carpet, until he stopped right in front of Keanu. Keanu had taken off his cap, revealing his messy dark hair, but he was still looking out the window, watching the clouds drift by. "Excuse me," the attendant said. His voice was clipped and formal, lacking the warmth he had shown the other passengers just moments before. "Since you are sitting in a crew area, I need to inform you of the service protocol." Keanu turned his head slowly. His face was calm, almost blank. He didn't look annoyed, just curious. "Okay," he said softly. "I have a very specific menu for the VIP guests today," the attendant continued, waving the menu slightly. "It includes pan-seared scallops, filet mignon, and a selection of vintage wines. However, for passengers traveling in the rear section, we usually offer the standard crew meal. It's a chicken wrap or a cold sandwich." He paused, letting the distinction hang in the air. "I can't just serve the premium food to anyone. The inventory is strictly monitored." Keanu looked at the menu, then up at the attendant. He wasn't hungry, but he was interested in the psychology playing out in front of him. He could see the attendant trying to assert dominance, trying to put him in a box labeled lesser. It was a classic power play. "I understand," Keanu said simply. "Whatever is easiest for you." The attendant seemed disappointed that Keanu hadn't argued. He wanted a conflict so he could justify his bad behavior. Instead, he just got acceptance. "Right. Well, I'll bring you the water bottle now. Don't expect me to come running back here every 5 minutes, though. I have real passengers to attend to." With that, the attendant spun around and marched back to the front. Keanu watched him go. He turned back to the window. He had been on thousands of flights in his life, from cramped middle seats in economy to luxurious private jets. He had seen it all. But this was new. It was fascinating to watch someone try so hard to be mean. A little while later, a younger flight attendant appeared from the galley. She had been busy preparing the drinks cart in the front, but she had noticed the tension. She was a quiet woman with a kind face who actually enjoyed her job. She walked toward the back with a glass of iced water and a warm smile. She had recognized Keanu the moment she saw him board, despite the disguise, but she respected his privacy enough not to make a scene. She stopped by his row and leaned in slightly. "Mr. Reeves," she whispered, her voice low so the other attendant couldn't hear. "I am so sorry about the service up front. Can I get you something else? Anything you want? We have the filet, or I can make you a fresh fruit plate." Keanu looked at her and smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile that showed his appreciation. "Thank you," he said, his voice gentle. "That's very kind, but I'm okay." "Really? Please don't go to any trouble." "Are you sure?" she asked, looking worried. "It's really no trouble." "I'm sure," Keanu replied. "I'm just happy to be on the flight. Please take care of the others." The girl nodded and walked away, shaking her head slightly at the rudeness of her colleague. She went back to the galley, where the lead attendant was arranging champagne flutes on a silver tray. She couldn't hold her tongue any longer. "Why are you treating him like that?" she asked, keeping her voice down. "Treating who? Like what?" the attendant snapped, not looking at her. "The guy in the back, he's clearly a deadbeat pilot friend of the captain or something. Look at him. He smells like old leather and road dust. He doesn't belong in this cabin." "He is a guest," she insisted. "And he is sitting right there. He can hear you." "Let him hear," the attendant scoffed. "Maybe next time he'll think twice about dressing like a bum when he flies on a luxury jet. It's about respect, you know. You have to respect the environment. If he doesn't respect himself, why should I respect him?" He picked up the silver tray and walked into the main cabin to serve the businessman and the couple. "Champagne, sir?" he asked, bowing slightly. "And for the madam a fresh glass of the 2015 Merlot." He was the picture of perfection. He poured the wine with a flourish, laughing at their jokes and making sure their pillows were fluffed. But every time he walked back to the galley, he cast a dark glare at the back of the plane. It was eating him up inside. He felt like the presence of the scruffy man was lowering the class of the entire flight. He couldn't relax. He couldn't enjoy his job because he was fixated on proving that he was better than the guy in the green windbreaker. Keanu sat peacefully, oblivious to the internal monologue of the attendant. He had put his headphones on and was listening to some soft music. He was thinking about his destination, New York, and the meetings he had lined up. He wasn't thinking about the chicken wrap or the lack of champagne. He found that when you stopped expecting things to be perfect, they usually turned out okay. The seat was comfortable, the view was amazing, and the coffee he had been offered earlier was hot. That was enough. But the attendant was not done. As the flight progressed, he became more and more agitated by the calmness of the passenger in the back. It bothered him that his insults and slights weren't getting a reaction. He wanted to see a crack in the armor. He wanted to see the man get angry or beg for better service. About 2 hours into the flight, the attendant walked back to the galley and grabbed a bottle of sparkling water. He filled a plastic cup, the kind you use on the ground, not the nice crystal glasses used in the air halfway. He didn't bring a napkin. He didn't bring a lime. He walked over to Keanu and stood over him, waiting for him to take his headphones off. Keanu saw him and paused his music. "Yes. Here," the attendant said, thrusting the plastic cup toward him. "Refill. Since you're not eating the food, I assume you're thirsty. Don't spill it. Plastic isn't as forgiving as glass. Keanu looked at the cup, then up at the attendant. For a split second, the air between them crackled. It wasn't anger from Keanu, it was just a moment of clarity. He saw right through the uniform and the arrogance. He saw a deeply insecure person who needed to put others down to feel tall. "Thank you," Keanu said. He took the cup. His hand was steady. "You're welcome," the attendant said, turning on his heel. "And try to keep your area clean. We have to clean this plane up in New York before the next owner boards it. I don't want to find crumbs everywhere." Keanu took a sip of the water. It was cold and refreshing. He watched the attendant walk away, feeling a pang of pity for him. It must be exhausting, Keanu thought, to carry around that much anger and judgment all day. It was like carrying a heavy stone in your pocket everywhere you went. Keanu set the cup down gently, making sure not to spill a drop, not because he was afraid of the attendant, but because it was the right thing to do. He closed his eyes again, letting the hum of the engines lull him into a light sleep, while the drama swirled around him like a storm. He was safely anchored in the middle of. The flight continued smoothly, cutting through the high clouds somewhere between the West Coast and the Midwest. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of tense silence that happens when people are angry but trying to hide it. The flight attendant was still moving around the main cabin, but his movements were sharp and jerky. He was polishing the already shiny tables with too much force, practically scrubbing the wood, as if trying to wipe away his own irritation. He kept looking back toward the rear of the plane. It bothered him that the passenger in the windbreaker hadn't complained. It bothered him that the man was just sitting there, quietly looking out the window or reading a book. The attendant wanted a reaction. He wanted the man to look upset so he could feel powerful. Instead, the man looked completely at peace, and that made the attendant even angrier. He felt like his authority was being ignored. In the main cabin, the other passengers were enjoying themselves. The businessman in the suit had his laptop open and was typing loudly. The couple was sipping their wine and looking at a magazine together. The attendant made sure they were happy. He refilled their glasses before they were even empty. He smiled at them and asked if the temperature was okay. He was treating them like royalty, but the moment he turned toward the back, his face hardened into a mask of disdain. As lunch service began, the smell of warm food filled the air. The young female attendant began preparing the trays. She was placing delicate white china, silverware, and linen napkins on the tables in the main cabin. She looked beautiful and professional, moving with a grace that made the whole experience feel elegant. She was about to prepare a tray for the back as well, following the specific menu orders the pilot had given her before takeoff. She reached for a plate that held a delicious-looking steak, cooked medium rare exactly as requested, and some roasted vegetables. She also picked up a crystal wine glass and a bottle of sparkling water. She was going to take it to the passenger in the back. She knew who he was, and she knew he deserved the best service on the plane, not the worst. Just as she turned around, the lead attendant stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He looked down at the tray in her hands and then up at her face with a scowl. "What do you think you are doing?" he asked, his voice low and sharp so the other passengers wouldn't hear. The younger attendant flinched, clutching the tray tighter. "I was taking this back to the passenger in seat 4B, she said quietly. He requested the steak, and the pilot confirmed. He did not request the steak, the lead attendant snapped, cutting her off. "I told you earlier. He gets the crew meal. That is a standard policy. Do you know how much that steak costs? It's not for someone dressed like that. Put it back. But sir, she stammered, feeling her face get hot. It's already plated. And he is a guest. We shouldn't treat people differently. We treat people according to their station, the attendant said harshly. He grabbed the steak plate from her hands and roughly dumped the food back into a metal bin. The sound of the silverware clattering was loud and harsh. He didn't care that he was ruining perfectly good food. He just wanted to prove a point. Give him the turkey wrap. And don't give him the glass. Give him a plastic cup. I don't want him breaking anything. The younger attendant felt tears stinging her eyes. She felt terrible about what was happening. She knew it was wrong, but she was afraid of losing her job if she argued with her boss. She nodded slowly, put the plastic wrap on the turkey sandwich, and poured water into a plastic cup. She felt ashamed as she walked toward the back of the plane. When she reached the row where Keanu was sitting, she stopped. He had taken his headphones off and was watching her approach. He saw the sad look on her face and the plastic cup in her hand. He saw that she was holding a simple sandwich wrapped in plastic, not the meal he knew was being served up front. He didn't look angry at her. He looked sympathetic. I am so sorry, she whispered, leaning in so only he could hear. Her voice was shaking a little. This is all we have for you right now. Keanu looked at the sandwich, then up at her. He saw that she was being forced to do this against her will. He gave her a soft, reassuring smile. Please don't worry, he said softly. This looks fine. I love turkey sandwiches, honestly. Thank you. He took the plastic cup and the sandwich from her hands. You're doing a great job, he added. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The girl blinked back a tear and whispered, thank you, before quickly walking away to hide her emotions. Keanu unwrapped the sandwich. It was cold and a bit squashed, but he was hungry. He took a bite. He wasn't thinking about the taste. He was thinking about the lead attendant. He realized that for some people, having a little bit of power makes them cruel. They think that because they control the food or the drinks, they control people. But Keanu knew that true power wasn't about controlling others, it was about controlling yourself. He was choosing to be happy with a sandwich on a private jet, while the attendant was miserable while serving filet mignon to millionaires. Meanwhile, the lead attendant was standing in the galley, feeling quite pleased with himself. He thought he had taught the girl a lesson about following the chain of command. He thought he had put the passenger in his place. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching the clouds through the small galley window. He began to talk to the businessman in the suit, who had come up to stretch his legs. The attendant lowered his voice, but it was still loud enough to carry to the back of the quiet plane if someone was listening closely. Some people, right, the attendant said, nodding his head toward the back. They think just because they know someone, they can act like they own the place. We have a guy back there, looks like he just came from a shelter, demanding the best service. It's ridiculous. It ruins the vibe for passengers like you who actually pay for this luxury. The businessman chuckled, glancing back briefly at the quiet figure in the windbreaker. That's too bad, the businessman said politely, though he didn't seem very interested. Whatever. As long as I get my drink. Oh, absolutely, the attendant said, turning his charm back on. For you, anything. But the attendant couldn't let it go. The cruelty was like an itch he had to scratch. He walked back toward the middle of the plane and pretended to adjust the air conditioning vents. While he was there, he raised his voice just enough. "I hope you aren't too cold back there," he said loudly, looking in the general direction of the rear seats but not directly at Keanu. "I know the heating doesn't always work as well in the crew section. It's an older part of the plane. You should have brought a warmer jacket." Keanu didn't look up. He was used to people projecting their own unhappiness onto others. He simply zipped up his green windbreaker a little higher and continued eating his sandwich. He knew that reacting would only feed the attendant's ego. The best revenge was being unbothered. The flight went on like this for another hour. Every time the attendant walked past, he made a little comment about the noise, the smell of the food, or the lack of legroom. It was a constant barrage of microaggressions. The younger attendant tried her best to mitigate the damage, bringing Keanu extra napkins or asking if he needed another pillow, but she was constantly shut down by her boss. Finally, the plane began its descent. The captain came on the intercom. "Good afternoon, everyone. We are beginning our descent into Teterboro Airport. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. We will be on the ground in about 30 minutes. The attendant began his final checks. He walked through the cabin, making sure the main passengers were buckled in. He saved the back for last. When he got to Keanu's row, he stood with his hands on his hips, looking down. "You can put that trash away now," he said, pointing at the sandwich wrapper. "We land soon. And make sure your area is clean. The cleaning crew in New York is very strict. If they find a mess, they report it, and it reflects poorly on me. I don't want to lose my bonus because of a lazy passenger." Keanu carefully folded his wrapper and placed it in the plastic cup. He placed it on the floor near his feet. "It's clean," Keanu said calmly. "Good," the attendant huffed. "And when we land, stay seated until all the other passengers have left. I don't want you blocking the aisle. The VIPs need to get off first. You can wait." He turned and walked back to the jump seat to buckle himself in for landing. The younger attendant caught Keanu's eye one last time. She mouthed the words "I'm sorry" again. Keanu just nodded and closed his eyes. The plane dropped through the clouds. The city of New York appeared in the distance, a sprawling grid of buildings and lights. The wheels extended with a clunk, and the engines roared as they slowed down. Keanu gripped the armrests lightly. He was tired of the flight. He was tired of the rude man. But he knew it was almost over. He also knew that the attendant had no idea what was waiting for him once the plane stopped. The landing gear touched down with a squeak, and the plane raced down the runway, slowing rapidly. The game was almost up, but the lead attendant was still acting like the king of the castle. The plane taxied smoothly along the runway at Teterboro Airport, the busy New York skyline visible in the distance through the small windows. The huge engines spooled down, and the gentle roar of the flight faded into a quiet hum. Inside the cabin, the mood was shifting. The other passengers began to unfasten their seat belts, the sound of clicking metal buckles filling the air. They gathered their things, ready to leave the luxury of the sky and return to their busy lives on the ground. The lead flight attendant stood up immediately, popping open the overhead bin doors to help the important guests. He was smiling again, his face plastered with a look of professional concern. He helped the businessman with his leather coat and made sure the couple had their designer bags. "Thank you for flying with us," he said to them, bowing his head slightly. "We hope to see you again soon." Once the main cabin passengers were ready and standing in the aisle, the attendant turned his gaze toward the back of the plane. His face hardened instantly. He walked down the aisle, his steps heavy and purposeful, until he reached the row where Keanu was sitting. Keanu was still seated, calmly looking out the window at the terminal buildings. He had his backpack resting on his lap. "Okay, time to move," the attendant said sharply. He didn't say please. He didn't wait for Keanu to stand up on his own. "The other passengers are leaving. You need to stay out of the way. Go sit in the jump seat by the galley so they can pass." Keanu looked up, surprised by the order. He hadn't caused any trouble. He had stayed quiet the whole time. "I have my bag," Keanu said softly, patting his backpack. "I can just stand here. I don't want to risk you bumping into anyone," the attendant snapped, his voice low and harsh. "Move. Now." Keanu sighed quietly. He realized there was no point in arguing. It was clear this man was determined to make him feel small until the very last second. Keanu stood up, his tall frame almost touching the ceiling of the cabin, and squeezed past the attendant. He walked to the small jump seat near the galley and sat down. The attendant watched him with a satisfied smirk, as if he had just won a victory. The door at the front of the plane opened, and the jetway extended. The cool evening air rushed in. The businessman and the couple walked past, chatting amongst themselves. They didn't even look at the man in the windbreaker sitting in the crew seat. To them, he was invisible. Once they were gone, the attendant turned to the young female attendant, who looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Clean up the cabin," he ordered. "I'm going to handle the paperwork." Just as he turned toward the cockpit door to check the flight log, the cockpit door swung open. The pilot stepped out. He had taken off his headset and was unbuttoning his jacket. He looked tired but happy. The flight had been on time and smooth, which is always a good thing for a pilot. The pilot stopped in the galley and looked around. He didn't see the VIPs first. He looked straight past the attendant and his eyes landed on Keanu sitting in the jump seat. A wide, genuine smile spread across the pilot's face. "Keanu. My friend." The pilot boomed, his voice loud and full of respect. He walked right past the frozen attendant and extended his hand toward Keanu. "We made it. Perfect flight, right? I hope you managed to get some rest back there." The air in the cabin seemed to stop moving. The lead attendant froze mid-step. His hand was reaching for a clipboard, but it just hung in the air. His eyes went wide, and his jaw dropped slightly. He looked at the pilot, then at the man in the green jacket, then back at the pilot. He felt like the floor had just disappeared beneath him. Keanu stood up from the jump seat, his easygoing nature returning now that they were on the ground. He smiled and shook the pilot's hand. "It was great," Keanu said. "Smooth landing. Thank you for getting us here safely." Of course," the pilot said warmly. "Is your car meeting you here on the ramp or do you want to go inside the terminal?" "No, I'll just walk out the back if that's okay," Keanu replied, swinging his backpack onto his shoulder. "I like the fresh air." The pilot laughed. "Whatever you want, boss. You own the jet, you make the rules." The word boss hit the attendant like a physical blow. He took a step back, his face turning pale. He looked at the shabby windbreaker again, and suddenly the pieces started fitting together in a terrifying way. The pilot had called him Keanu. The pilot had said, "You own the jet." The attendant's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He looked at the man's face, really looked at it for the first time without the filter of judgment. Under the messy hair and the shadow of the cap, there was no denying it. The nose, the eyes, the quiet demeanor. It was Keanu Reeves? The movie star. The man who was currently one of the biggest actors on the planet. And not only that. He was the owner. The attendant hadn't just been rude to a random passenger. He hadn't just mocked a poor backpacker. He had spent the last 5 hours verbally abusing, insulting, and degrading the man who actually signed the checks that paid his salary. The young female attendant let out a small gasp from the corner of the galley. She covered her mouth with her hand, watching the drama unfold. She had known, or at least suspected, and now her worst fears about her colleague's behavior were coming true. The lead attendant started to tremble. "Mr. Reeves," he stammered, his voice cracking. Keanu turned to look at him. For a moment, the attendant hoped Keanu would shout at him. He hoped Keanu would yell, "Do you know who I am?" because that would be a reaction the attendant understood. Anger he could handle. But Keanu didn't look angry. He just looked calm. That calmness was terrifying. It showed the attendant that Keanu was so far above this petty nonsense that it didn't even matter to him. "Yes," Keanu said simply. His tone was polite but distant. I didn't. I mean." The attendant was stumbling over his words. His brain was trying to find an excuse, a reason for his behavior. "Your clothes, the jacket, you looked like." Keanu looked down at his windbreaker. He touched the sleeve. "I know," Keanu said softly. "It's just a jacket." The pilot turned and looked at the attendant. The pilot's friendly expression vanished. He looked stern and serious. "Is there a problem?" the pilot asked. "I noticed the service log back here wasn't filled out correctly. And I saw that the meal order for the owner was cancelled. Did you not serve him the fillet?" The attendant's face turned bright red, then ghostly white. He couldn't speak. He felt sick to his stomach. He remembered dumping the steak into the trash. He remembered making fun of the sandwich. He remembered telling him to sit in the jump seat. Every cruel word came rushing back at him, echoing in his ears. I thought he was." The attendant started, but he couldn't finish the sentence. Saying "I thought he was poor" out loud would make him sound even worse. "You thought he was someone you could treat badly," the pilot said, his voice cold. "We have a strict rule on this aircraft. We treat every soul on board with respect. It doesn't matter if they are in a suit or a windbreaker. It doesn't matter if they own the plane or are just hitching a ride. Do you understand?" The attendant nodded, his head hanging low in shame. "Yes, sir," he whispered. He felt small. He felt like the smallest person in the world. All his arrogance, all his pride in his uniform, had evaporated in an instant. He had tried to make himself feel big by pushing someone else down, but he had only managed to embarrass himself completely. Keanu stepped forward. He placed a hand on the pilot's arm, as if to calm him down. "It's okay," Keanu said. "Really? It's just a misunderstanding. No harm done." The pilot looked at Keanu, surprised by his forgiveness. "He was rude to you, Keanu. That's not acceptable." "I know," Keanu said. "But I'm okay. I'm used to people judging books by covers. It happens." He looked at the attendant one last time. "Maybe next time, just offer the water without the speech. It tastes better that way." Keanu shouldered his bag and gave a small nod to the young female attendant. "Take care," he said to her. "Have a good night, Mr. Reeves," she whispered, smiling. Keanu walked toward the back door of the plane. The ground agent opened it, and the cool New York breeze flowed in. Keanu descended the stairs, his boots hitting the tarmac with a thud. He didn't look back. He just walked toward a waiting black car parked on the ramp, his hands in his pockets, looking like a regular guy again. Inside the plane, the silence was deafening. The attendant stood there, shaking, staring at the empty doorway where the movie star had just disappeared. He looked at the trash bin where the filet mignon was rotting. He looked at the plastic cup sitting in the jump seat. He realized that in his obsession with status and appearance, he had missed the most important person on the flight. He had failed the simplest test of character, and he knew that no amount of pressed uniforms or polished shoes could fix the shame he felt in his heart right now. The black SUV drove away from the plane, its red tail lights fading into the darkening evening of New Jersey. Inside the Gulfstream jet, the silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the cruise, it was the uncomfortable, ringing silence of a guilty conscience. The lead attendant stood frozen in the middle of the galley, his eyes fixed on the spot where Keanu Reeves had been standing just moments ago. He felt as if the ground had opened up beneath him. He looked down at his uniform. It was still crisp, still pressed, the name tag still shining brightly. But for the first time in his career, it felt like a costume. He realized that while he looked the part of a high-end service professional, he had failed completely at the actual job. He felt sick to his stomach, a knot of regret twisting tighter and tighter. He remembered the way he had sneered, the way he had dumped the steak into the trash, and the way he had mocked the man's clothes. All of it echoed in his mind, mocking him now. The pilot was still standing near the cockpit door, his arms crossed and his expression stern. He watched the attendant with a look of disappointment that was far worse than any shouting could have been. The younger female attendant was quietly clearing the cups from the main cabin, moving slowly, glancing nervously at her colleague. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. The atmosphere said everything. I didn't know, the lead attendant stammered, breaking the silence. His voice was weak and shaky. He turned to the pilot, looking for sympathy, for an excuse, for anything that could make this feeling go away. He looked, nobody told me. He looked like a drifter. The pilot shook his head slowly. Does it matter? He asked, his voice calm but carrying a heavy weight. Look at this plane. Look at the leather, the wood, the crystal. This is a luxury service. Our job is to be good to people, regardless of who they are. You judged a man by his jacket, not by his heart. That is a failure of character, not just a failure of your job. The attendant slumped against the counter. He felt small. He wanted to argue that he was just following protocol, that he was protecting the quality of the flight, but he knew those were lies. The truth was, he had been cruel. He had been cruel because it made him feel powerful. He had looked at someone he thought was below him and decided to stomp on him. Now, he realized that the person he thought was below him was actually miles above him in terms of class, dignity, and success. The worst part was the way Keanu had reacted. Or rather, how he hadn't reacted. If Keanu had screamed at him, the attendant could have written it off as the actor being a diva. But Keanu hadn't screamed. He had been quiet. He had accepted the sandwich. He had thanked the girl. He had even made a joke about the water at the end. That grace, that politeness in the face of such rudeness, made the attendant feel even worse. It held a mirror up to his own ugly behavior. He owns the jet, the attendant whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. It was hard to grasp. The man he had told to sit in the jump seat was the man who bought the fuel, paid the crew's salaries, and owned the very chair he was leaning on. Yes, he does, the pilot said firmly. And he is a good man. A very humble man. He could have had you fired on the spot. He could have made a scene that would have cost you your career in this industry. But he didn't. He walked away. The younger attendant walked over to the trash bin to finish cleaning. She pulled out the bag and saw the ruined filet mignon wrapped in plastic at the top. She looked at the food, then at the lead attendant. "He was going to eat this," she said softly. "This was his meal. You threw away his dinner." The attendant looked at the wasted steak. It felt like a symbol of his own stupidity. He had wasted an opportunity to serve someone great, and he had wasted good food just to be mean. "I have to go," the attendant said suddenly. He couldn't stand there anymore. He needed to get off the plane, away from the judgmental eyes of the pilot and the kind, sad eyes of his colleague. "We still have to clean and lock up," the pilot reminded him, his voice not unkind, but authoritative. "I'll clean later," the attendant muttered. He grabbed his things and practically ran down the aisle. He walked down the stairs and onto the tarmac. The air was cold, biting at his face, but he welcomed the feeling. He felt like he deserved to be uncomfortable. He walked away from the plane, heading toward the terminal building. He looked out at the other private jets parked on the dark runway. They were beautiful machines, symbols of wealth and success. But as he looked at them, he realized that the planes didn't matter. The people inside them mattered. The way you treated them mattered. He thought about his own life. He had always tried to look successful. He bought expensive clothes, wore a fancy watch, and acted like he was better than the common people. He thought that being a VIP was about acting important, but Keanu Reeves, a man who actually was a VIP, had acted like a regular person. He had worn a cheap jacket, carried a backpack, and treated everyone with basic decency. The attendant realized he had it backwards. He was acting like a king without a kingdom, while the real king had been sitting in the back eating a turkey wrap. This experience wasn't just a scary moment at work, it was a life lesson. It was a wake-up call. The attendant knew that when he went back to work, things would have to change. He couldn't treat people based on their appearance anymore. He had to learn to see the human being inside the clothes. He sat on a bench near the terminal, burying his face in his hands. He felt a deep shame, but underneath that shame, a tiny seed of gratitude was growing. He was grateful that Keanu hadn't ruined him. He was grateful that he had learned this lesson now, before he became an even bitter, older man. It was a hard lesson, taught in a humiliating way, but it was one he would never forget. Meanwhile, in the city, Keanu Reeves arrived at his hotel. He walked through the lobby, still wearing his green windbreaker and baseball cap. A few people looked up, curious, but most ignored him. He checked in, grabbed his key, and headed up to his room. He wasn't angry about the flight. He didn't spend his time thinking about the rude attendant. He had learned long ago that holding on to anger only hurts yourself. He dropped his bag on the floor and walked over to the window of his room. He looked out at the lights of New York City. Millions of stories were happening down there. People were falling in love, people were fighting, people were eating dinner, and people were making mistakes just like the flight attendant had. Keanu took a deep breath and smiled. He was just happy to be safe. He hoped the attendant would be okay. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, the next time a guy in a worn-out jacket walked onto a plane, the attendant would pour him a glass of water and ask him how his day was. Back at the airport, the pilot and the younger attendant finished locking up the jet. The pilot placed the logbook on the table. "He's a good man," the pilot said again, shaking his head. "We don't get many like him." "No, we don't," the girl agreed. She looked at her boss. "Are you going to report him?" she asked. The pilot sighed and looked out the window toward the terminal where the attendant had disappeared. "I'll have to write something up," he said slowly. "I can't ignore how he treated a passenger. But I won't demand he be fired. I think he punished himself enough today. Sometimes, realizing you were wrong is the worst punishment of all." He closed the plane door with a final thud. The jet was dark and quiet, waiting for its next journey. The story of the flight was over, but the lesson it taught would stay with the people involved for a long time. It was a simple lesson, really: be kind. You never know who is sitting across from you, you never know who is wearing the disguise. And in the end, kindness is the only thing that really matters. The jet sat silently on the tarmac, a beautiful bird resting for the night, holding the secrets of the day within its metal walls.